Welcome to the Stanford Silicon Valley New Japan Project Public Forum Series. Here at universities, usually the professors like to be introduced by somebody else who reads a nice, long, flattering introduction. However, we here at the Stanford Silicon Valley New Japan Project, we are a lean startup. So I do everything myself. So except for a hardworking staff that prepares everything. So I do my own self-introduction. I'll do the initial one. I'll introduce myself, and then I'll give the talk. I'm Kenji Kushida. I'm a research associate here at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, and I'm project leader of this project called the Stanford Silicon Valley New Japan Project. The purpose of the Stanford Silicon Valley New Japan Project is to become a sustained platform for Silicon Valley Japan activities. Because from at least 25 years ago, I came to Silicon Valley, I grew up in Japan, I came here about 20 years ago for college. Lots of Japanese firms had a presence here, but they were not part of the ecosystem harnessing the value from the ecosystem. And this was very frustrating. And now the time is right for us to be here at Stanford to be able to harness what's good in Silicon Valley and bring it together, what's new and exciting about Japan, and benefit together. Both sides can harness each other. This is the project to do it. We have public forum series with networking, lots of research activities. We do policy analysis and implementation. We do research collaborations with places like UC Berkeley, EU, Keio University, the OECD. We're going to do a big conference on AI, earning, working, and learning in an age of AI with Berkeley. And we do outreach. Outreach are big public activities. Our big activity is the Silicon Valley New Japan Summit. This is from last year, and we're going to do another one this year, November 28 and 29, so later this month. The purpose of the Silicon Valley New Japan Summit is to bring together about 60 Silicon Valley startups and about 100 plus Japanese large companies to be able to work together. And so there's a business matching booth in the afternoon and panels of large Japanese companies and how they worked with startups. So a panel with the startup, the large Japanese company, I moderate, and we figure out what the lessons are from there. This year we've added a second day, which is the first day. The first day is in Japanese, looking at various big firms around here, Japanese firms that have done very interesting things in the Silicon Valley ecosystem. So the first day is a boot camp. The second day has a few panels and then a business matching. So please look at, just search the web for Silicon Valley New Japan Summit. And this is what it looked like last year. We had about 600 people in the room. And then we did a small one in the summer in Tokyo, where we brought together some of the main people and then did some more panels to raise interest for this. And we're doing it again this year. There's still some space available. It's not free, but you can take a look at svs100.com. That's where it is. And the project, the Stanford Silicon Valley New Japan Project, is only possible thanks to the generous support of the following companies. This is a industry-academia collaboration. We can only do things thanks to them, our research, etc. Kozo Keikaku Engineering, Future Architect, Komatsu, Mistletoe, Kawasaki Heavy Industries, JX Nippon Mining and Metals, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, World Innovation Lab, and at the silver level, ANA, tech firm, Canon, Mitsubishi Corporation, Musashi Sakai Driving School, this is an interesting one, SMBC, Development Bank of Japan, KPMG Azusa, Nedo, Daikin, and Rakuten. And even though there's not enough space with this configuration, we're always looking for more people, so we'll make more space if you want your logo there too. So thank you to everybody for supporting us. Now, this is part of what you've supported. Our topic today is innovation and entrepreneurship in Japan. Does Japan still matter for global competition? I'm hoping the answer is yes. I think you're hoping the answer is yes, but let's think about it a little more rigorously. I often give talks to a general audience, and it's more entertaining and less academic. However, this is a slightly more academic one, which means there's a lot to cover in a short amount of time, and I talk too fast anyway. So I hope you had some coffee. If you get sleepy, you can go get some, because we're going to have an intense time, if that's okay. So the core questions, we always have to ask questions. Whenever we're working with research reports on anything, often people will say, I want to look at this. Okay, that's fine, but what's the question? If you can define a good question, this is 70% of the work done. But in this case, the question is pretty easy. Does Japan still matter in global competition? How do we answer this? One approach to answer this is to ask, what are the fundamental underlying drivers of the next wave of industrial transformations? Where is Japan positioned in this transformation? So instead of just looking at Japan, we're looking at how the world is shifting and where is Japan positioned in there. It's not simply about technologies, but how technologies are used, right? So not just looking at, for example, AI. Is Japan at the forefront of developing AI? Well, that's one of the things, but how about using it, for example? So, and how has Japan's large firm innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem evolved over the past 20 years? Oh, and by the way, these slides will be public, so unless you really want it immediately, no need to take pictures, although you're welcome to. Outline, this is what we're going to cover. Why Japan mattered historically and why it ceased to matter as much. Advantage of global IT innovation, what we call the Algorithmic Revolution and Silicon Valley innovation system. Third, we're going to talk about transformations in Japan's entrepreneurial ecosystem. Fourth, we're going to look at new attempts by innovative Japanese large firms. So, why did Japan matter the most in the 70s and 80s? This is actually not such an obvious question. Why did it matter? You can point to various things, but the underlying dynamic of why it actually mattered was three things. One, it reshaped global technological trajectories, right? A lot of the technologies were invented elsewhere, but they were commercialized and mass-produced with Japanese companies. The Japanese companies were able to commercialize CMOS chips, quartz watches like Seiko, LCD panels with Sharp, and several other areas where the inventions came from places like Bell Labs or RCA Labs, but they were not able to commercialize it. Japanese companies in this era went in and found a lot of those inventions and managed to commercialize them. They miniaturized them, solved many of the technological engineering issues, and were able to bring them to market. This was at the core of it. So technological trajectories, Japanese firms reshaped global technological trajectories. Second, they transformed and created major global industries. So if we think about the global players in the 1960s, before the Japanese surge in areas like automobiles, semiconductors, consumer electronics, there were great firms like Zenith that made your televisions, RCA that made your electric equipment. Well, they all went by the wayside. And the global industry leaders, semiconductors, Japanese led quite a bit for some time. And so there was a reordering, right? Nobody knew about Japanese cars until the oil shock, and then some low quality ones came. The quality went up rapidly, and then the whole global map was transformed. Third, contributed to innovations in industrial production processes. How does production happen? And this is, of course, the very famous lean production pioneered by Toyota and quickly spread elsewhere. It's new information flows, right? There's the traditional model of having the blueprint going down. Manufacturing people are just piecemeal, but instead the Toyota production model, it harnesses the manufacturing people on the plant floor. The information can travel up just in time production. You don't need inventories. You can build in quality improvements with no marginal cost. And so it was a new way of producing things. Everybody in the world had to adjust to these Japanese, these Japanese three things. Shifting global technological trajectories, making everything small, transforming the global industries, and contributing to innovations in industrial production processes, right? So the failures of those who could not adjust led to a big renewal of things like the US industrial model. Because if we think about a traditional system of a large company, lifetime employment, seniority ranking, R&D that happens in-house, lots of business dealings with affiliated suppliers. This is a US traditional large company model, right? IBM way, the HP way, once a GM man, always a GM man, this kind of thing, where it was actually the US model was very similar to what we now consider a Japanese model. But then the US model diverged, partly because of the stagflation after the oil shocks of the 70s, but also as a response to the Japanese competition that did all of these. And as a result, we see open innovation like IBM cutting 40% of its people and making a rapid transition, Zenith going under and going bankrupt, RCA pulling back from most of what it could do and becoming a very low-key entity. So then what the US had to adjust to, the successful ones, made open innovation and then harnessing external actors, partly as a response to the very success of the Japanese model that surged into global markets at this time. So of course, the open innovation model, which also harnesses Silicon Valley, because if you're going to take in ideas from outside and then people move outside and this kind of thing, that also helped the rise of Silicon Valley. So if they were similar historically, but then the US diverged and created an open innovation model, well, of course, it's strong against Japan's traditional strengths, because the ones that lost out are gone and the ones that adjusted are still here. And that's the big picture. So why did Japan seem to fall into irrelevance? Two things happened at the same time which were very unfortunate. The 1990 asset bubble burst, right? And I was very annoyed at all the analysis through the 90s and early 2000s saying, oh, the Japanese assumed that land prices would always go up. They'd borrow money based on the assumption that land prices would go up all the time. How silly is that? Land prices stopped to go up. Oh, and then it was a house of cards. And people kept on pointing at Japan. And then the same thing happened here, right? Only with much more sophisticated ways. In the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, all the models said they would go up. So not unique to Japan, but it was a big asset bubble burst. And this basically made it very difficult to make investments just as the IT revolution hit. So two things, the asset bubble burst and a technological paradigm shift occurred, and Silicon Valley was the driver of that. At around this time, Silicon Valley did become the leader in pulling the US out of its recession of the 1980s. And Silicon Valley started doing these things. First, reshaping global technological trajectories, like the rise of the PC industry, right? Instead of vertically integrated mainframes, we had PCs where the value was in Windows and Intel chips, and then the rest were modular components that each had markets, completely different manufacturing paradigm, different way of how to get value out of it. Platforms, let's compete based on platforms, and things like category killers like smartphones that swept away quite a few until then independent markets. They transformed major global industries. These came out on top. They pioneered a new production system, right? Designed in California, manufactured in China, this kind of thing. Cross-national production systems, the rise of Asia. This was all possible because of the open innovation paradigm. But basically, this area became the center for doing all of this. So that's a big reason why Japan seemed to fall into irrelevance. Japan also had some of its own unique problems. The Galapagos phenomenon, as it's referred to in Japan, I call it more precisely leading without followers. For example, we'll make, the graphics became a little too small, but it really looks like Galapagos, which is a geographically segmented island off of the in the South Pacific that then had its own ecosystem. The cell phones and things like this of from the late 90s to the 2000s, right? The Japanese ones were wonderful. You can open like this, twist around, and do all sorts of things. Lots of features, and they were leading, except there were no followers. The rest of the world never became like that. And I was wondering when they would, but they never did. And then 10 years later, it got disrupted with the smartphone. And now the ecosystem is pretty much taken over by the others. It's a big tragedy, but this has happened many times. Like if you ride the trains, right, the Suica and all of its competitors, several different areas. Leading without follow. Broadband, cheap, fast broadband. Broadband here, around here, is very slow and expensive. And in 2002, Japan became the fastest and cheapest broadband infrastructure anywhere in the world. But just having the infrastructure didn't somehow magically unlock all of this innovation and entrepreneurship. It was just actually a factor that trapped some, because if you needed really high-speed broadband, it would work in Japan, but it wouldn't work anywhere else in the world. So there's this persistent, recurring problem called leading without followers. I'm writing a book about it, so we'll stop there. But this is a Japan-specific problem that happens elsewhere, but it's most exaggerated there. Our friends and our supporters, SMBC, put this together, right? Top 15 market cap of US companies. The highlighted ones are Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley rises from 1980. You can see the value. But market cap, it might be a bubble. Actually, let's look at cash. Cash, it's kind of hard to bubble cash. Well, it depends on how much you print, but that's a critique of Abenomics. We won't go there. So we can have the most cash in the world. This is real. Even if the stock market crashes, Apple still has much more cash than almost everybody else almost combined. And the others up there, Microsoft, Alphabet. I mean, Microsoft was initially a VC. It has big development centers right here. like to claim it's also partly Silicon Valley Logic, Alphabet, which is Google, right? Cisco, Oracle, all these others. They hold the most cash. So they can buy things, they can do things, even if the market crashes. So Japan's evolution since the 1990s. How has Japan transformed since the 1990s? And it's very interesting because I use a concept called syncretism, and we wrote a book with this title. But here's the pattern that we see. It's the coexistence of traditional, new, and hybrid organizations and practices. Because if you look at some of the traditional areas, it looks very traditional. You look at how most regional banks work. They look extremely traditional. You walk there 20 years ago, you walk in there now, people's cell phones are a little different, but it's not that different. So then if you just go to the traditional part, people say, oh, it's just traditional, nothing changes. But then there's a new part. The startup ecosystem looks very different than 20 years ago. The rise of foreign firms in the 1980s, when Motorola tried to go into Japan and become a cell phone player, it was very difficult for them to try to break into the market because there was a legitimate security concern saying, we can't have our cellular networks being controlled by a foreign firm. This is a problem. And for other areas like finance, it was very difficult for foreign firms to go in. There was a definite sort of concerted effort to try, implicit and explicit, to try to maintain Japanese sovereignty over Japanese economic activities at the core. But then that shifted radically in the late 90s, and by the end of the 1990s, foreign firms are being beckoned in. Hey, we have some problems here. Please come in and solve this. There were some big bankruptcies. So there it looks very different. I did my dissertation on foreign firms in Japan, and just growing up, I had a fascinating experience. My father was a salaryman of a very traditional Japanese shipping company, right? He'd be on the train every morning for 30 years, 300% capacity, and he'd be doing that. And then I'd go to his office in weekends, and it'd be a traditional floor layout. He's younger, he's over here. Then he made his way over here, over here, over here. And then there's the island. If he gets above there, he goes over here, and then over there. He never made it all the way. He went to Hong Kong, but that's okay. That happens to many people. So then, but then I took an internship at a financial firm in the year 2000, and it was just a couple blocks from my father's office, but it was completely different. It was a foreign financial firm, and people would get fired left and right, and there's a lot of fast rising, fast falling. It looked nothing like what my father, but they're sitting next to each other. This was the new, a part of the new part. And then hybrid. While people were looking elsewhere in the world, Japan's core institutions like keiretsu and things started to break down, and things that would have been unthinkable 2 decades ago happened very easily, where corporate groups, there were tie-ups across corporate groups, and then spin-outs of former rivals, then joining hands together to make a joint venture in a business that was having trouble, things like this. And then another part of hybrid that we're going to look at is efforts towards open innovation, harnessing external ideas and resources. So what we're going to focus on here is part of the new, the startup ecosystem, and part of the hybrid. But our conception of how Japan has changed is syncretism. The coexisting, it's not like the old replaces the new still exists as a distinct thing. The traditional exists as a fairly distinct thing, and then there's hybrid. So you see all three coexisting. So Japan today, just a punchline. It's nice to have punchlines here and there. More large firms are embracing more real open innovation. I can't wait till the day that I can delete the parentheses, the words in there. So large firms, all large firms are embracing real open innovation. What this means is they're investing in partnering and harnessing outside firms to enhance their core business offerings. They've been doing open innovation for quite a while, but often that's well outside of their core business offerings. It's things that are tangential. Now it's getting closer to the core. Growing cases of partnerships with Silicon Valley firms. That's where it's so interesting looking here. And the startup ecosystem within Japan has grown significantly, and we're seeing new levels of partnership and cooperation with large firms. It looks, in my understated way of saying things, it looks completely different than about 20 years ago. So before we jump into looking at just Japan, we have to look at global IT innovation. Because if we're going to say Japan is more innovative or less innovative, how can you say that looking just at Japan? Often people like to count patents or things like this. Patents may not be innovation. They may not lead to commercial value. Maybe that doesn't matter. How many core patents of Google made Google so wealthy? Approximately 0, right? So that's not it. How do you measure innovation? Very difficult. So my way of around this is to look at the competitive adjustment and looking at the vantage on global competition, which is that, we often talk about global markets, and there are global financial markets where everything is sort of mishmashed together. But in almost all other markets, and even finance to some degree, global markets are actually just multiple domestic political economies competing on a global stage. So simply comparing one place to another also often misses the direct competition that shape each other interactively. So, for example, the world adjusted to the Japanese production system, which grew out of the specific political economic context. If there wasn't very early on post-war protection put in by the American occupation, actually, of protecting Japanese core industries that were then followed up, then a lot of incubation couldn't have happened. And also Silicon Valley innovation. It grew out of a specific national and regional political context, rules and regulations that were shaped by politics. For example, network neutrality, saying that AT&T and these other network owning companies were not allowed to discriminate pricing on some users versus other users, corporate users, for example. And this kind of regulation actively protected Silicon Valley innovation because, let's say that early stage Google had a very good search engine, and let's say people locked into AT&T and Comcast. They said, okay, well, here's our search engine. It's terrible, but you're going to use this one because we're going to charge this early stage Google 200 times the price that we're charging it now to use our network, and we're going to charge our own one approximately nothing, so that people would be stuck with something that's not as good. Well, the FCC in the US, the Federal Communications Commission, actively went in and regulated over time the ability of network carriers to discriminate against the companies using their networks, and this is network neutrality. This is one of several things that really supported Silicon Valley. So many Silicon Valley entrepreneurs will go say, yeah, it's all in a private market and the government really doesn't matter. Actually, making the context the government mattered a great deal. It wasn't a strategy saying, here's our industrial policy, Silicon Valley is going to be the winner. It wasn't that kind, but it was definitely shaped by the rules and regulations and the context. And that shaped the technological and industrial structural development patterns that we saw. Without Cold War concerns to get massive computing power through semiconductors in the Cold War, well, that led to a big boom over here of R&D budgets, military expenditures, and that led to some of the semiconductor developments that then supported Silicon Valley. For example, there's a whole literature on this. Our project has a recommended reading list for Silicon Valley if you want to look further. So how is Japan adjusting to Silicon Valley competition? Well, let's look a little bit more about what's happening in Silicon Valley. It's what we call, the underlying driver is the algorithmic revolution. Basically, once formalized, human activities can be captured by software algorithms. Once human activities are algorithms, they can be split apart, transformed, recombined, and magnified. And AI, artificial intelligence, accelerates this algorithmic revolution because you don't even need to formalize human activities to capture them. AI is essentially pattern recognition, and without understanding the causal mechanisms, you can capture patterns of human activity. And so Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, said that this, I mean, he put it in basically these words, and it sums it up very easily why we see an acceleration of all of this. And what we see is all of this is enabled by computing power, which has transformed from a scarce resource. For almost all of human history, the ability to calculate things and store information was a scarce resource, right? Starting with, you have a piece of stone that you have to carve, you have to invent mathematics, and then you have books. You have Gutenberg's printing press, which is books, but it's not calculations. But now, just over the past few years, actually, with the advent of global scale cloud computing, computing power is cheap and it's abundant. So we can use a lot of it to do many things that we never could before. And it's improving at an exponential speed. So there's a paper we wrote about that a while ago. about global scale cloud computing. So what this enables is actually this thing that we are calling, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, algorithmic revolution is underlying what we see, like sharing economy, AI, robotics, fintech, IoT, and then the other things that are going to show up that we're going to be surprised that we haven't heard about them 2 years from now. So the algorithmic revolution is below and the underlying driver of all of this. And the basic sort of dynamic here is that there were so many activities that only humans could do. Try to list up in your mind every single activity that only humans can do right now. Let's say, getting a haircut, folding clothes, driving a car. Well, the list is getting shorter and shorter, right? 3 years ago, driving a car, we could say Uber pushes it over towards hybrid, and productivity gains go from low to medium because it optimizes who's picking up who and who's going to ride. Fine. But then all of a sudden, now we're talking about fully automated, where you don't even need a person. Even in Uber Lyft, point A to point B driving still takes a certain amount of time, but the human core activity now transforms with automated driving. And even folding clothes, a fun Japanese startup called Seven Dreamers just created a box that's about a refrigerator that you throw your clothes in, and everything except for your socks, which are still too hard, it'll fold it after about 6 hours. So even folding clothes is on the path to being automated. Now it takes 6 hours. I'm sure that'll be faster and faster. And if they fail commercially, someone else, it's already been done, so they can do it. So think of like a telephone call from here to New York 50 years ago. Right? I pick up my phone on my desk, and then an operator in this building, there's still a building, this building is 100 years old, there's still a room that used to be the operator's room, right? And then they connect it to the campus one connects it to AT&T local office connects it to long distance, and then in Manhattan it goes through about 4 other people, and then it goes through, well, all of that automated, but this is old news. And several 100,000 jobs disappeared when operators became automated with simple switches. So just think of how many things have been automated so far, and then moving forward, how many things can be automated next. That's the algorithmic revolution. And this drives rapid improvements in productivity, but then who needs the rapid improvements in productivity? Well, Silicon Valley captures and generates a lot of this effectively because of the logic of venture capital investing, right? If you have a portfolio of 100 companies and it's a 10-year fund, the top Silicon Valley VCs will get the entire performance of that portfolio out of just one home run. One, what's the right English word for it? But there's a nice term in Japanese, right? Outside of the ballpark home run. Just one of those out of 100 companies over 10 years. So the rest, they either say, okay, you're done, we're going to dissolve you, or they sell them off to M&A. So then, if you think about it, they can only do M&A or an IPO for the VC to exit. And since there's a lot of competition among VCs, because as an asset class, VC is actually not that profitable. There are too many people chasing too few opportunities. But the top ones, there's so much pressure for rapid, scalable growth. And automating human activities is the most scalable, right? So you see how it all fits together. We have abundant processing power. We have the ability to capture human activities, move them towards automation. And automation is what scales the most, right? My favorite joke of Silicon Valley, other than people that make jokes of themselves, is that no matter if you're in a meeting room or you're having a conversation and you want to sound like the smartest person in the room, all you say is, that's a good point. But does it scale? Right? It works for everything. Try it. That's a great idea. And it's a scientific revolution, but does it scale? That's a business idea, but does it scale? Honey, please go shopping. Well, wait a minute. Does it scale? Yeah. So I should, But anyway, automating human activities is most scalable. That's why Silicon Valley, which is fueled by VC, there's plenty of VC investment in not very good things, but the core is driving towards this. That's our contention. So technology diffusion really goes forward in leaps and bounds when cutting-edge tools become commonplace commodities. Right? Let's think about this. Last year, Google used DeepMind, its AI engine, to beat the Go World Champion. It was 5 games, 4 matches they won. Well, 1 match DeepMind lost. And then this past summer, it's not on there. This past summer, then DeepMind beat the world champion very decisively. And then last month, DeepMind used the next iteration of its program for Go, which is AlphaGo. They put a paper in Nature saying that they developed AlphaGo 0, which played against the previous AlphaGo that had beat the world champions humans, and it beat the old one 100 to 0, right? And the old AlphaGo, it spent, it did something like 40 million games against all existing previous Go matches and learned that way. And it spent several months to do this. And the new one, it only needed to do instead of 40 million, 1.5 million times, and it only needed a couple weeks, and all it did was get told the rules of the game, and it was able to do this. So we're talking leaps and bounds here. But that's cutting edge stuff that happens only within Google. And another big news item that I didn't understand why I didn't get more coverage was, because Google just announced this, we just have to believe them, and if we do, then Google used DeepMind to optimize the efficiency of its data center cooling. According to Google, Google data centers, which are billion-dollar facilities, they use 0.01% of the world's electricity. That's a lot of electricity. Its cooling was already quite optimized. So then they found that optimizing the data center cooling, they found a 40% efficiency gain in the cooling efficiency, and so the electricity consumption decreased by 15%. This is real. And so then the question becomes, well, what happens when something like Google's DeepMind or Google's DeepMind itself becomes a commodity? What if you can use DeepMind tomorrow for, let's say, $20 a month, $10 a month? What would you optimize with an AI engine that powerful? Well, if this is happening tomorrow, the question is, well, I don't know how to use it exactly. Exactly, that's the point. There will be tool makers that will help figure out how to make DeepMind useful for you. The ecosystem will develop, but it will be a commodity offering. And so when what is right now a cutting edge technology becomes so commonplace that everybody can use it, that's when civilization moves radically fast. My other favorite example is the 1969 mission to the moon, the Apollo mission. Had the world's fastest supercomputer there in the mission control, because even a slight mistake and those people would not have come back alive. The processing power in the 1969 Apollo mission, core mission control processor, was about the same as the 1985 Nintendo Entertainment System processor. Right? So that's how fast things are improving. The fastest computer in 1985, when some of us were using the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Famicom. The fastest one was the Cray 2 supercomputer. The Cray 2 supercomputer, which was the fastest computer in the world in 1985, was about 1/6 the processing speed of the now obsolete iPhone 4, right? So in this case, how much processing power has moved forward and how much processing power has diffused? It's mind-boggling. So this kind of thing, and this is a complete commodity. I only buy cheap cell phones because they break, or I break them. So this is a commodity, but it's at least 20 times more powerful than the Apollo mission, right? This is pretty incredible if we think about it. So AI, moving forward, how is this going to affect us? So this is a little bit of the Silicon Valley part. And of course, technology diffusion doesn't happen because of the nature of technology itself. It's not the attributes of technology that determine how that technology diffuses. It's always about how the conditions surrounding large companies and startups and regulatory context. The context matters for how actual technology diffuses. And so things like, what are the technological alternatives at the time? What are the rules and regulations surrounding various usages cases, right? When is the automated bus going to be safe enough to carry students in the Marguerite? Probably quite a bit later than private citizens who are just interested in having an automated car, right? The rules might be different in different places. Regional Japanese bus lines where there aren't enough drivers and the roads are fairly safe and because there are no children running out. So what are the politics driving solutions and bargains to regulatory issues? So data privacy and sovereignty, depending on the rules of how these things are dealt with. For example, EU privacy rules. This may decelerate diffusion of certain kinds of technologies significantly. Other places like the US that have very loose controls if you remember the Equifax issue, where roughly 1/2 of the US population's sensitive data were lost or hacked, and the immediate response of the responsible company was for the CEO and CTO to quit and get golden parachutes and go disappear somewhere. This was not a Silicon Valley company. They're based in Georgia. But still, this kind of thing wouldn't have happened elsewhere. But at the same time, that kind of Equifax data did push forward analyses of human behavior quite a bit. So things like AI and robotics, right? In Japan, there aren't enough people. So it would be great for robots and AI to do the jobs for which there are no people. Here, there are lots of people who would prefer not to be displaced by AI and robots. And so whenever somebody has a news item of a radically automated robot, it's always that same picture of the Terminator, that shows up and says, here come the machines. But rarely do you see that in the Japanese context, right? So now, Silicon Valley and Japan. See, you thought you were going to hear about Japan. It's actually about Silicon Valley. But then now we're going to go to Japan because that's what matters. Comparing Silicon Valley and Japan, many people do that, but sort of what's the point, right? Silicon Valley is like this. Everywhere else in the world, for whatever you want to compare against Silicon Valley, except for things like social equity and commute times, it looks like this, right? And so the question is, the better question is, how has Japan transformed to better compete or harness Silicon Valley innovation? What are the institutional characteristics underpinning the Silicon Valley ecosystem? What makes Silicon Valley Silicon Valley? And here's we did a paper on this a couple years ago. The institutional characteristics, it's best broken down into financial system, labor market, university, government ties, relationship between large firms and small firms, social systems as related to entrepreneurship, and professional services ecosystem. So financial system, venture capital based. Labor market, fluid at all levels, in all directions. Multifaceted and multi-directional industry university government ties. It's not just about universities coming up with IP and patents, moving those to the private sector and getting paid for that. The Stanford Technology Licensing Office equivalent started in 1970, and they've had about 10,000 IP cases, including patents. And of those 10,000, roughly six of them were responsible for about 60% of the returns over 40 years. So that's not a good batting average. And this is Stanford. And so trying to get TLO offices, technology licensing offices, to somehow unlock and unleash all this valuable IP in universities, that's not the main part of how universities that are successful in industry-university relations work, right? Hal Varian, who made Google's matching price auction mechanism algorithm and helped them go from no business model to one of the most valuable companies holding cash and market valuation in the history of humankind. That kind of rapid growth we don't see very much, right? Other than taking over other countries or finding rare metals. That doesn't happen very often. The guy who made the algorithm of auction pricing that led to all of this wealth, he was a UC Berkeley professor in economics, Hal Varian. He took a sabbatical year when Larry Page and Sergey Brin were still making Google they were still working as a small office in downtown Palo Alto on University Avenue. And they said, we have all this data, come play with us. And he went there and made the basis of the algorithm, and then went back to UC Berkeley. And then Google became Google, and so much wealth created. They eventually invited him as a chief scientist to a chief economist in Google, and they just threw him a birthday party a few months ago and said, thank you for making billions for us. Well, was this UC Berkeley IP that was transferred to the private sector? No, it's a tragedy, but they got basically nothing. But the professor did fine for himself, but it's basically the mechanism of how to access university brains and resources doesn't just happen through IP transfer. It's multifaceted. There's a nice book about this, again, in our recommended reading list. An open innovation, symbiosis. Without large firms buying startups, there would not be a huge creation of startups because there aren't enough firms to buy them. It's symbiosis. So people often look at the startups in Silicon Valley, but it's actually the large firms that enables the startup ecosystem. And social systems, right? Celebration of entrepreneurship. It's cool to be an entrepreneur. Graduates here will go there. It's not something like your mother will say, that's a well, your mother still might say it's a bad idea, but it's celebrated around here and supported. All sorts of support mechanisms. You throw a stone and every department now, almost every department has a entrepreneurship linkage because otherwise students leave and go elsewhere, etc. Professional services ecosystem, right? Law firms, accounting firms. Law firms and accounting firms see much more startups than venture capitalists. They're the ones that often are the first filter. And so there's expertise built up in those. And note that it's a historical evolution. It's not inherent. There are multiple US models. The Silicon Valley model is not the US model. Take a plane to New York and walk around Wall Street, very different. At the same time, this wasn't a strategy that somebody developed. It developed organically. So how did Japan's startup ecosystem look like in the mid-1990s when people started analyzing Silicon Valley in the mid-1990s because clearly it was the center of technological transformation, production innovation, global industry revamping. There was a lot of scholarship looking at this. How did Japan look compared to the Silicon Valley system, right? Financial system was bank-centered with traditional financial markets, labor market, long-term employment with seniority ties. So then labor markets were illiquid. The best and brightest were locked into large firms for their entire career. There were formal regulatory constraints on universities. For example, Tokyo University professors were not allowed to have other income or other jobs. And so those kinds of things were shown as impediments. Lack of brain circulation of people going back and forth. Closed innovation was what everybody did, with large firms doing in-house R&D, and they were not interested in business with startups overall. So the biggest challenge of startups was to try to get their product or service purchased or used by large firms. And for a long time, entrepreneurship was seen as the low prestige versus large firms and the government. If you're a good student, you go to a good university, you go to a good company, and only if that doesn't succeed, you become an entrepreneur. People fell into this. And the prestige really wasn't very high. There weren't many role models to look after either. And the ecosystem of professional services was very small. However, lots of changes happened since the mid-1990s. And after many regulatory changes, we have a very different picture of what we see now. I go and hang out with entrepreneurs a lot these days, and partly because there's enough of a community to do that. So for finance, we have new small cap financial markets, right, like the Mothers market and the consolidation of several others that were competing, a growing VC industry, and among the venture capital industry, what's very important is that the rise of independent VCs, not people who are from large financial firms, the VC branch of it, who expect to go back. It's independent VCs who have their own stake in them. Labor mobility is increasing, especially in the IT sector and with foreign firms, lower prestige and opportunity with large firms, right? What bright-eyed, wonderful engineering student who's really interested in changing the world is going to go work for, it's a tragedy, for Toshiba now, right? It's not so attractive. How about for Sharp? It's not clear where that's going to go. And universities have refocused, regulations have changed. We'll go through all of these in subsequent slides. Firms are more interested in open innovation, more than just lip service this time around. And the rising attractiveness of entrepreneurship as large firms enter competitive crisis, and there are increasing cases of quite successful startups. And law firms and accounting firms are setting up startup-focused practice areas like Deloitte Tomatsu Venture Support, right? KPMG, one of our Azusa accounting firm, one of our supporters. And law firms are increasingly setting up practices here, and at least they're interested in becoming ecosystem players. So regulatory reforms enabled new options. But of course, Japan still remains centered around large firms, but the venture capital industry is deepening. And there's a high level of investment in science and technology-based R&D from the government and educational institutions. This is one of Japan's strengths. Lots of investment in science and technology and S&T-based R&D. And we'll see data on this. And social norm changes driven by economic environment and maturation of a support ecosystem. 10, 12 years ago, if you were an entrepreneur, and you're a good entrepreneur, you'd try to be a little bit, in Japan, you'd be a little bit quiet about how successful you are because of the trauma from Horie Takafumi, Horiemon Live Door. And so there was an entrepreneur that had a glitzy lifestyle, private jets and all of this, and very rapidly growing. And through some accounting improprieties, he was thrown into jail. This had a very chilling effect on the psyche of entrepreneurs. I mean, imagine if Mark Zuckerberg and the Google guys got thrown in jail for a while, right? It would have a chilling effect. And so, but now the chilling effect has, I'd say, it's run its course. And there's a new crop of very, very promising and very successful entrepreneurs. So some of the changes, legal changes, regulatory changes, we do not need to go into detail. Stock options, angel investor tax, corporate organization, the option of doing different forms, university industry ties, funding, stock options, allowing stock options. That was a big one. And the rise of independent venture capitals. So you can look at the amount of VC in Japan and look at it go up and down and things like this. But actually, I argue that what matters more is what kind of venture capital is it? Are these financial firm branches where somebody is told for, okay, Mr. So-and-so, your job now for 3 years is to run our venture capital fund. Then are they going to do the same kind of investing like the ones here where, okay, we have 10 years, we're going to go for the home run that hits it out of the stand? Or since it's 3 years and I'm going to be evaluated at the end of 3 years, let's have a few, 1 base hits, 2 base hits if we're lucky, and play it safe and not many failing. And then the next person comes in and it's the same thing. So the kind matters more. And we talked about this in the previous slides. We'll have details. So this is of a couple of years ago, but still independent VCs made up for 35% of the new funds created in 2015. I need to get the data for last year. This year's data is not out yet. But the point here is the stock of not independent VCs is much larger. But in terms of the new one creation, there was a surge of independent VCs. And this is a good thing. The amount invested by venture capitalists globally looks like this. The US is the big one, Silicon Valley is this one. Japan is very low down there. What does this graph tell us? It tells us that Japan doesn't have much VC, but that's not the interesting one. The interesting one is that if the amount is so small, of course trends in Japanese VC are likely to be affected by these much bigger macro trends, right? So then, first, let's look at Japan compared to some of its comparable sizes, because anywhere compared to Silicon Valley is tiny for VC amounts. In 2010, it's bigger than Germany, UK, France, Israel, Korea. 2015, Korea had a big jump, but Japan was still more VC than Germany, UK, France, Israel. Of course, just looking at amounts isn't the point, but if we are to look at amounts over time, if you look at just Japan, you could say, oh, something happened here and this happened, something happened there. What's the structural change that caused this jump? Well, maybe it was also just pulled by the very large total amount, and it just gets pulled by that. So what I'm saying is, let's also, whenever we compare one place with another place, let's look at not just the place we're looking at, but also figure out what other things can pull the numbers around. And so we see that. Now, here's where it starts to get even more fun, where if we look at the sectoral variety of startups in Japan, I still talk to government people sometimes or big company people who will say, Japanese startups, they're mostly just gaming companies. Well, maybe that's been the case, but let's look at who raised the most VC funding in Japan a couple of years ago and look at what sectors they are from. Right? And so this new generation biomaterial development, SPIBER, marketing tools and consulting service in mobile, this makes it more familiar, commercial printing service, producing platelet products from iPS cells, cell regeneration. This is Professor Yamanaka, the Nobel Prize winning biologist, iPS, commercial DNA sequencer, mobility hardware products, industrial IoT applications with AI, commercial microsatellite imaging and data services, cloud data management problem. This is a pretty broad range of sectors. We're not just talking gaming. And of course, since these are startups, many of these will not exist a few years from now, but that's fine. And then let's look at where the founders are from. This is another change too. Some of the top ones, and I have a list of the entire, a much broader list, but it doesn't fit on the screen. They're educated at elite universities. In fact, there are very few founders who are from not the handful of elite universities of the large startups that have received the most funding. So the elite are doing startups. And a lot of their previous employment, it's also interesting. Folks like Google, and then the longer list has McKinsey and a lot, not too many from traditional big companies. So this indicates a different career path. Here's the second page of that, right? And then McKinsey, Dell Japan, some foreign firms, etc. Japan's small cap markets was a critical development, right? Mothers by Tokyo Stock Exchange, NASDAQ Japan, which was a joint venture between Osaka Stock Exchange and NASDAQ, and SoftBank was in there too, doing the deal. A lot of that consolidated, but we had several small cap markets. Now, Japan's small cap markets are very small. If we look at the average amount raised in an IPO of small cap markets in Japan, Mothers or JASDAQ versus the US NASDAQ, it's about a tenth, a little less than a tenth. And the median size is also quite small. Well, what does this mean? On the one hand, it means that since it's so easy to IPO at a small size, Japanese VCs will say, hey, I want my returns, you IPO now. Whereas if it's in the US, they'll say, well, that's your series C, round C or so, and then you need to grow, and then when you IPO, you're huge. And in Japan, it's more of a one base hit, two base hit, because once you IPO, you cannot go in the negative for too long and then have this massive rapid growth that's expected of Silicon Valleys. So one problem is that it hinders truly large high growth firms from emerging, because if your VC wants you to IPO in 3 years, you can't be in the negative for 5 years doing this and then jumping up. However, the upside is that it's actually easier in many ways to IPO in Japan than the US. The exit strategy might be more predictable. So in this case, what kind of startups might be better to have a predictable exit strategy? Well, how about something that's science and technology based that does not scale as much as Silicon Valley software based ones can? Does it scale question? Well, if it doesn't need to scale, maybe there's a way where if you're doing something that might scale like a Silicon Valley startup, do it here. And if you have something that's very science and technology based that doesn't scale quite at the speed, maybe you should do it there. There might be something there to this. The number of IPOs in Japan after the financial crisis dropped precipitously, and then it's rising again. So that's recovering. And then examples of some recent IPOs in Japan. Again, let's look at the sectors, right? Money forward, financial management services, the shopping platform, MetApps, marketing tools, and consulting. And then some interesting ones. Well, these are all interesting, but like Helios. One of my friends does this, but it's an IPS regenerative medicine product for certain kinds of eye diseases. They were able to IPO. I'm pretty sure that they cannot IPO in the US for quite some time, even if they tried, but they were able to in Japan. And talking to the founder, he says, basically that put him on a very stable financial footing where you don't have to keep trying to favor curry with VCs that need rapid growth. He can now grow this stably and get the technology better. So, and of course, yeah, there's the famous Cyberdyne, Japan's robot suit by Professor Sankai in Hitotsubashi University. So M&A in Japan is increasing. It's still at a very low level. Many more big Japanese firms should be buying startups. And the current set of, sorry about the graph, the current set of lots of startups are bought by big companies that started themselves as startups. This is also familiar here, right? Google and Apple were startups. They buy a lot of companies. Well, there's INCJ, the government fund. We don't need to talk too much about that, not that it's not important, but government expenditure on R&D as a percentage of GDP. This is probably one of Japan's strengths. Here's Japan. Here is the United States and China has recently gone up as a percentage of GDP greater than Japan. But as a percent of GDP, Japan actually still does do a lot of expenditure by the government on R&D. And now looking at higher education expenditure on R&D, normalized for purchasing power parity, we see the US is way above everybody else. Japan did get surpassed by China, but Japan is still much higher, a fair amount higher than other G7 countries here. So again, R&D based is one of Japan's strengths. And recently we do see a wave of science and technology based startups. And this became a little easier after regulatory reforms. Cyberdyne was one of the early ones, and Spiber, new protein, which allows the synthesis of protein. It came out of Nagoya University. Some of the scientists say if this technology is completed, making proteins, synthesizing them is very difficult, and their technology might be Nobel-worthy. Nobel happens decades down, but still. So sources of entrepreneurial talent. Who are the startups, and who are the early followers who become the initial employees of startups? Well, the context has changed. The longevity of large Japanese firms is called into question, right? After a series of shocks in the late 90s, finance opened up. LTBC suddenly went under. Yamaichi Securities dropped dead all of a sudden, and this released a lot of people into the labor market. And now with NEC, Fujitsu, Sony losing global competition for semiconductors, we saw what happened to Sanyo. It became absorbed into Panasonic. Sharp got bought by Foxconn. Toshiba's accounting scandal, some very good people are very depressed right now in there. The damage from buying a Westinghouse was severe. It's getting split apart. And lifetime employment career paths at large companies are less attractive for elite university graduates. It's a lot of people right out of college still are looking for a job in a big company that's prestigious, it's stable, etc. But after a few years, they get very restless, and the opportunities available for them are much better than any time in recent history. Many people they know, their friends, etc., will have quit and started new startups and say, hey, don't you want to come to us? And the pool of entrepreneurs derived from large firms. So companies like, and we'll introduce these a little later, Cerevo, UPQ, Wantedly, Free, Agri-Info Design, they came from large firms, foreign firms, and government. It's a new kind of career path. And large companies, too, have been cutting back their employment very significantly. It came as a surprise to me that it was this level, but between 2010 and 2015, NEC has cut 30% of its workforce. Some of that was overseas, but Hitachi has cut 11%, Sony cut 18%. This is actually opening out people because there are people that are former employees of this kind of place who are looking for something to do. Some of them were let go because they're not very good, but plenty of people are very good, and others left because they want to do something else, early retirement schemes. M&A in Japan. Overall, M&A in Japan has increased quite a bit, although of course most of this M&A is small family-run companies that either have to liquidate or get bought out. So startups are a small number of this, but still it's increasing. And some notable acquisitions, the robotics company Shaft, it'll show up in a bit, was purchased by Google a few years ago and then purchased by SoftBank. New types of collaboration. Large firms and startups are collaborating in new ways deeper than ever before. And accelerators and incubators, there are lots of them, they're growing. Even Plugandplay from Silicon Valley is going there. And here are some more, this duplicates some acquisitions of Japanese startups. The support ecosystem for entrepreneurs is stronger than it has been ever before. Startup pitch contests are happening all over the place. And the major startup-related events are becoming major focal points. For example, the New Economy Summit. Rakuten's Mr. Mikitani was instrumental in setting this up. And they have an annual meeting and some policy recommendations, but they also have a startup pitch contest. Infinity Ventures Summit is one of the, IVF is one of the well-known ones. Slush Asia has moved into Japan. Nedo, related to, well, it's basically in effect, METI has the technology commercialization program of startups that have R&D support from Nedo. I've been to some of these, and a few years ago they were not so impressive, and the last couple of years they've been much, much more impressive. The growth of startup ecosystem, right? Tomatsu Venture Support, Nedo, and others. There are more ecosystem players that are actively trying to foster this. And so the question is often asked here, oh, is that just lip service by the government? Are they actually trying to do something? This time around, it really does feel like they are actually doing something and really interested. Strengthening ties between Silicon Valley and Japanese startup ecosystem. So let's look at some startups. Spiber, it's a biomaterials company that successfully created synthetic spider silk by decoding genetic information of fibroin, a protein that's the main component of spider silk. And this technology grew out of a lab at Keio University. Let's look at Cyberdyne. It grew out of Tsukuba University and produces robotic suits that assist human movement. It worked closely with large German companies, received accreditation from the European Commission in 2013, and in developing the world's first robotic remedial device. It went public on Mothers in 2014. I talked to the founder of this and I was wondering why they were growing so slowly, because from Silicon Valley perspective, they should have taken over the world by now. And he said that when he spun it out in 2004, it was a very different world. He couldn't find venture capital financing. He had to take out bank loans. The infrastructure wasn't there. But now the situation is very different if you have something promising. Cerevo is an interesting hardware firm. It designs products that connect to the internet, provide functionality, and it was founded by a former employee of Panasonic, and it drew engineers from almost every major Japanese consumer electronics company like Sony, Panasonic, NEC, and others. And when I talked to him, when he gave a talk here a couple of years ago, and he said, yeah, the one company that we haven't gotten anyone from is Toshiba. That might have changed. UPQ, it's a consumer electronics startup founded in 2015. It made headlines when it introduced 24 extremely highly well-designed products in the first 2 months. It used Chinese suppliers and had her own design. And she was a designer who initially worked for Casio to design their mobile phones. The Casio Galapagos mobile phones were great. They were really great. But when Casio withdrew, she said, okay, well, my purpose of being in this company is no longer there, so I'm going to leave. And she's doing what she wants to, and she was able to get VC funding and corporate partners to do this. And very early on, either Bic Kamera or Yodobashi, I forget which, one of the big electronics chains, were happily carried her products. This was new too. Breaking into supply chains used to be a big challenge for up-end starts, but she was right there doing that. Wantedly is a recruiting firm founded by Akiko Naka, who was a Kyoto University graduate, and her first job was at Goldman Sachs. And then she went and joined Facebook. She gave a talk here also, when Facebook still had something like 6 employees in Japan. So it felt like a startup. And so she was able to quickly get her service of matching people adopted by IT companies. It's essentially a recruiting service. And it went public very recently. Soracom just got purchased by KDDI for about 200 million, which is a nice size acquisition of the kind that hasn't been seen too much yet, but it was a marker of something. It was basically, it provides IoT solutions through a SIM chip with cellular connectivity, so you can get a device and allow it to connect to make it an IoT device. And it used Docomo's network, and it used some of the IP from Docomo that Docomo was not using. They were happy to spin it out. And the founders previously worked at Amazon, and they had experience working to facilitate the diffusion of Amazon Web Services. Because back to Silicon Valley, with computing resources becoming starting as a scarce resource and becoming an abundant resource, Amazon is one of the major players. Even as of 8 or 9 years ago, the number of websites running on AWS was about 1/3 the websites that people go to every day. It was already a big infrastructure player. Numbers have been unclear since then, but it's one of the major players. So they had experience there and to do this kind of thing. Another one of my favorite ones is, let's see what the 農業情報設計者 agricultural information design company. Oh, sorry, it's there. Agri Info Design is a startup It provides Android smartphone application that uses GPS to enable farmers to move their tractors in straight lines for field. This is great in developing countries, especially where in Japan or the US you buy a new machine or you lease it and it can do auto driving. But if you're in a developing country, you don't have the capital to do that. So this application will just make sure that you're going in a straight line as you plot as you seed things, as you harvest things. And the founder, Mr. Hamada, he was actually a senior researcher at the National Agriculture and Bio-Oriented Research Organization within the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries. So we have former bureaucrats becoming entrepreneurs. And I don't know, I have many friends who are elite bureaucrats, and this is great. But by the time that you have bureaucrats becoming entrepreneurs, that's probably a signal that things have shifted a little. So another symbiosis between large firms and startups. Free is a fintech firm that provides financial tools. It's sort of like FreshBooks here. And the founder, Sasaki Daisuke, and Mr. Yokoji, they previously worked at Google and Sony. And they were able to get 1,600 banks to integrate their services, making it easy for users to integrate their accounting with the banks. And Sasaki's interpersonal networks from his time at Google led to an introduction to venture capitalists here. So he actually got Silicon Valley funding because he worked at Google Japan and took trips here. Talking about all IT, sorry, the aspect ratio shifted, so this got changed. Of course I didn't make the slide to look at like that. So these are new kinds of interpersonal networks that didn't exist 15 years ago because there weren't people working in Google as much as there were now in Japan, for example. And Preferred Networks is a company that provides machine learning algorithms and tools. And it was founded in 2014 by a Tokyo University computer scientist. And some of Japan's top manufacturers like Toyota and Fanuc, they've partnered with Preferred Networks to do automation in their factory for robotics. And a lot of AI and machine learning. So here we have essentially startups working with old, established, traditional, very competitive companies like Toyota doing very core things. And so this is new. And another one, it's more fun in the motion picture version, but the robotics startup Shaft was founded by University of Tokyo researchers focused on producing walking robots. It dominated the early rounds of the US DARPA Robotics Challenge, and it was purchased by Google before it went to the finals, and Google didn't let it compete in the finals because if you win the DARPA challenge, then you get money from the Department of Defense. Google didn't want to receive money from the Department of Defense, and so they pulled it out of the competition, but it dominated. And then SoftBank bought, after Google had some reorganization, they weren't quite sure what to do with it, they sold it to SoftBank. And so here again, here are some two Tokyo University researchers, and they were right down the street there for a while at Google improving this. And I think one of them is still in the area. So this is all new. Also, another thing to look at are Japanese participants in Y Combinator and 500 startups, some of the marquee accelerators here. There were some. Past couple of years, there have been none, unfortunately. However, there were some then, and some like 500 startups, Mr. Sugie, who's making Wheel, which is a personal mobility device, and others like Mr. Fujikawa making Fly Data, and others. So this is also new. Some Japanese firms have invested successfully into Silicon Valley unicorns. Docomo Innovations into Evernote was a big success. Others, investments by Recruit into DocuSign, and Rakuten's investment into Lyft and Pinterest, SoftBank into Sophie. And of course, if we now talk about Mr. Son Masayoshi's Vision Fund, the extremely big fund investments, then where it's a completely different picture. You saw they invested into Uber today and whatnot. But again, how to deal with SoftBank is another very interesting question for an analysis like this. Now, large firm innovation. We've talked about startups, but there's some very exciting things underway by large Japanese firms in Silicon Valley. Many of them will show up in our summit later this month. And so, part academic, part marketer. So Yamaha, for example, within less than a year, they worked with SRI, which used to be Stanford Research Institute, changed names in the 70s, SRI, to develop a humanoid robot that can autonomously ride a motorcycle. You may ask, what's the point? But because it's a motorcycle, who else is going to ride it? But that's not the point. The what's the point is not the point. They learned all sorts of technological expertise by doing this. They had it in the Tokyo, in the last month, I think, race against Mr. Rossi, one of the fastest motorcycle racers in the world. Luckily, the robot lost, so they still have things to do with this. But they were able to do it at a shockingly low price compared to what they thought they would require. And SRI had all this knowledge and expertise on doing autonomous driving, but no big company was going to partner with them to make them make something, well, you might call it silly because you can't sell this thing quite yet. And if we look at what GE is doing right now, for example, a lot of big Japanese firms like to look at GE as sort of a very, very elite company to strive towards. It keeps changing its core competence. It buys things, sells things. Well, GE just slashed a whole bunch of technologically very interesting things, putting IoT into locomotives and other things. And that's not the kind of partner that SRI would find willing to do something like this. So SRI was able to do it very quickly and very cheaply, and they can run with it. Toyota has its new Toyota Research Institute that hired a star scientist that used to run the DARPA Automated Driving Challenge, Gil Pratt, and they're putting some resources into that to develop various things. One of my favorites is Honda, which the Honda Open Innovation Labs partnered with startups such as Drive Mode to allow cell phone to control the screen and a system, entertainment system and navigation system in the actual car. I don't know about your cars, but I don't, well, my car doesn't even have a screen. But the point is, when was the last time you used the screen and navigation service in your car and looked at this and said, this is no good, I'm going to use that one instead? Almost never. It's always the other way around. In fact, most people cover up their screen using one of these. So to be able to do that kind of thing took a lot of convincing of the home office. And they have a lab where they can partner with startups. The startups do not have a prototype car to work with. They do not have automotive engineers to work with. Honda does. The Open Innovation Labs in Silicon Valley provides those things. They co-develop whatever they're developing together, and then the startup is free to offer their services to someone else, like GM, which is much bigger than Honda. So a Japanese company allowing startups to co-develop something with them, they give resources, but then allowing it to have the first customer somewhere else is quite remarkable. The way Honda thinks about it is, well, if this service is then implemented into GM from a zero base, scratch up, then it takes 3 years for it to implement. However, we've been working on it together with these guys, so we can get it out in a year. And in the IT industry, 2 years can mean a lot of big change. So that's not the point. This is a new kind of open innovation. And my absolute favorite one is Komatsu, and not just because, as a little boy, these things are wonderful, but they've actually pushed the envelope on both AI and IA. What AI often is artificial intelligence that replaces people. But from the 1960s onward, the development paradigm in computer science for AI was bifurcated between AI that replaces people and IA, where there's always a person there and you augment the person. Intelligence augmentation. And Komatsu has been doing both. They used AI to have automated mining trucks since 2008. The holy grail of what many places in Silicon Valley are doing now. They've been doing it since 2008. Of course, it's a closed environment, a harsh environment, but closed, so it's easier in that sense. But still, they've been doing that. And then they're finding things like, if you don't have a person at the wheel, those huge dump trucks have very expensive tires. And since they're carrying very heavy things, the tires wear out quite quickly. And if someone gets a little sleepy and then they make a sudden movement, the damage to the tires is very significant. So by having it completely autopilot, they can save the operators remarkable double-digit savings on tire wear and tear replacement costs. And so they've been doing that. At the same time, they also do IA, which enables low-skilled workers to perform high-skill requirement tasks. So if you're using a digger and trying to use a digger to dig a slope, if you think about it, it's a circular motion trying to hit the tangent of something like this, but you're looking at it perpendicularly. So it's very hard to see how far to go. It's very easy to dig a bit too much, but you cannot do something at a Japanese construction site, for example, where you dig a little too much and you say, oops, and then you put it back and then make a high rise. You can't do that. You have to recalculate, make a new cut, very costly. So to do this kind of operation, somebody would require 10 years of training. You need to be an expert to do this. But with their new system, they have sensors all over the digger so that even if you don't have the skills, if you're about to make a mistake, the machine will stop. Or you bring the machine to somewhere close and then it will do the cut for you. And so even, maybe they're exaggerating a little bit, but they're showing somebody who it's their first day on the job and they can suddenly do this thing that a 10-year veteran could do, only a 10-year veteran could do. Well, this means Komatsu, this is really cool, but at the same time, it's a paradigm, right? With AI, what are the jobs that will be replaced? You can count jobs and say, okay, this will be replaced, this will be replaced. A lot of the current very specific projections are based on an Oxford working paper. It wasn't peer-reviewed published, it was a working paper. And sorry, it's filmed. No, I've met the guy, he's a little gloomy. But, and then places like McKinsey take that and then magnify it and say, wow, so many jobs are gonna disappear. But then, how about the jobs that you have low-skilled people doing formerly high-skilled jobs, like DeepMind or IBM Watson finding that for things like CT scan identification of what the problem is, the AI did a better job than doctors overall. So then, should you have the doctors doing this task that machines can do at a higher probability of success, and maybe they should focus on doing operations and not spend their time doing that? Then who's going to do the job of looking at CT scans? It used to be highly educated doctors. Now it could be just a non-skilled worker taking the data and then putting it somewhere. So how many jobs are going to disappear with AI versus how many new jobs are going to be created through IA? Well, it's unknowable, fundamentally unknowable right now, because we have no, again, back to the Silicon Valley logic, so many people are making tools and systems to be able to do IA as well as AI. And so here we return to Japan again. AI development lives off of data and processing power. Here at the computer science department, somebody was telling me that you take the very latest AI algorithm and one that's 3 years old. Amazing difference in the quality, but you give the newer one bad data and the older one good data. The older one can outperform the newer one under a variety of contexts. So the quality of data matters. Devices with cheap sensors, human-machine interactions, where can you get some of this data? Well, the politics of AI in Japan are very different than what's developing in the US, right? If it's an AI something that enables people to get data and then helps machines do the job for which there are not enough people to do, this can be very beneficial to society. And unless strange rules through bureaucratic logic happen, which sometimes they do, then you could potentially get all sorts of experiments, diffusion, gathering data of the sorts that are very difficult to do politically here. So in conclusion, this was a lot, and I'm happy to entertain conversations later, and our website has many places that you can go to for many of these points are actually working papers in of themselves. So there's an expression, drinking from a fire hose, not recommended, but that's what most of my talks end up. In conclusion, here are some ways that Japan still matters in global competition in a digital era. So there's a massive industrial base for AI deployments and activities to be harnessed and used. So China is a good example for new kinds of data being collected, right? Tencent has its services where if you want to borrow a bicycle, one of those borrow bicycles using your QR code, you have to have a personal credit score that's fairly high, and the personal credit score will go down if you do things like drive a car late at night very fast, or you do activities that look like gambling, then your score goes down and you can't borrow. That's in China. You can get that kind of data that you can't get elsewhere, so they can do that. But what about Japan? There's one of my favorite examples that will show up in the summit is Citrine Informatics, which is a materials informatics company where they'll go into a company and there's all this data in all companies for, say, materials and other things where, let's say, we want this kind of property. Then you have to do about 1,000 experiments or more to get to that property. This is what I want for, let's say, this car part. 1,000 experiments to do that. There are about 27 or 28 different parameters for which there's data, and you have to optimize for all of those. And the question is, do you add a little more zinc or do you subtract a little carbon? It's not data-based, it's the people's expertise based on what they've done before. And so what Citrine can do is get all that data, and then for the data that it has, it can plug in the values. And for the values that it doesn't have, then it has AI, machine learning, to try to estimate those. So when then you say, I'd like this kind of outcome, they can say, well, here's what we recommend. And then you try the experiment based on the data and the estimates, and then you get the truth, right? You can then get data for everything. And that makes the machine learning better and better. So this is the kind of thing where there's a platform that's made by a material science PhD and an AI PhD and then a business school person. By themselves, they don't have the data to make it get better. But there are a lot of big Japanese firms for if you could cut down the number of experiments you can do by 20–25%. This is great. And then at the same time, that frees up people to do frontier research even more. Both get value from this. And so Japan, again, the context of wealthy aging society, it's very wealthy. A lot of aging people are extremely wealthy compared to other aging people in other societies. And the politics of AI and robotics seen as solving. It's a good test bed and deployment use cases. And people are relatively less averse to aggressive deployment of both AI and IA. It's celebrated. Even cases of a proprietary developed bread store that used image recognition to be able to measure things in a very clever way to get, basically you get your bread from the thing and you put it to the register and the register automatically tells you. And it's a tale of triumph, not a tale of, oh, these poor bakers are going to go out of business because there aren't enough bakers and people. So increasing large firms' effort to harness Silicon Valley, they are still few and far between. We need many more. But the number is increasing, and there are interesting patterns of a sort that we haven't seen before. And then the entrepreneurial ecosystem is developing very rapidly and possibly complementary to Silicon Valley. So thank you very much. That was way too much, and happy to entertain questions, but we don't have time, so happy to meet you out in the hallway and talk later. So hope you join us for the next time. Thank you very much.